Welcome to Family Law A to Z with DBD.
Hey everyone, welcome back to an all-new episode of Family Law A to Z with DBD, a podcast from the Pennsylvania-based firm Deschel, Bartle, and Dooley. I am your host, Mike Leon. You know, this series reflects the collective experience of the firm's family law team, including attorneys Mark Deschel, Elizabeth Billies, and Katie Lin Daly, who work closely together to provide that clear, practical guidance on the legal issues that are impacting you and your family. Katie's joining me for today's episode, and we're going to be talking about understanding child custody and the basics every parent in the state should know. Katie has been focused exclusively on family law, helping individuals and families kind of navigate the custody, support, and related matters with this steady, client-centered approach. And she's been committed to helping people really understand the process, make informed decisions, and move forward with that clarity that you need, right? So, Katie, it's good to see you as always. I want to ask you at a 30,000-foot overview here about child custody in the state. Like what does child custody mean under Pennsylvania law at its most basic level?
Sure, and thanks for having me, Mike. So, general overview. When we talk about custody, we're talking about everybody's favorite topic, which is their kids. We're talking about where are they sleeping at night. We're talking about who's making important decisions for them. And that's really what the court is considering. They're thinking about what is in the best interest of these kids, and in terms of their parents, who's making the correct decisions and who's living with the kids, either half of the time, all of the time, some of the time.
Katie, in that same lane, I know Pennsylvania custody law has used a couple terms that I would love for you to kind of explain. Legal custody, physical custody. Like, walk us through what those terms mean in real life.
Of course. So legal custody is decision-making power. Who decides where the kids are going to go to school? Who decides if the kids are going to go to this doctor or that doctor? Who decides if somebody's getting braces, if somebody's getting vaccinated, if somebody's taking confirmation classes or getting bar mitzvahed? That's a legal custody decision. And there's two types of legal custody. There's shared legal custody, where both parents make those decisions jointly. And then there's sole legal custody, where one parent has the ability to make those decisions. Now, there's a caveat to that, which is sometimes what the court will do is they'll say, mom has legal custody for school, and every other decision is shared between the parties. And that really happens when there's some sort of disagreement that is not in the child's best interest. And the court says, mom has the kid's best interest at heart, so mom's going to be able to make that call. But that's really a court decision and not something that the parents are going to do themselves. So when we're talking about physical custody, we're talking about where is your child putting their head to sleep at night? Where are they living? With whom are they living? When we're talking about physical custody as well, we also might be talking about supervised physical custody. And that would be implicated in situations where maybe there's abuse, or maybe there's been a long period where one parent hasn't had any interactions with the child. So it's where is the child's body physically, and where are they putting their head at night?
Katie, on that point and expanding on that point, because you mentioned this in a previous episode that custody can look different, obviously, from one family to another. What are some factors that kind of shape what a custody arrangement actually looks like?
So there's a couple answers to that question. And first, I'll say legally, there are custody factors that the court has to consider. There used to be 16, now there's 11. And those factors are things like, where do the parents live in relation to one another? Who is the primary person who's doing parental duties? Who's doing the homework? Who's doing bedtime? Who's taking the kids to the doctor? Has either parent disparaged the other parent in front of the children? And in the case of older children, we might even be looking at, what do the kids prefer? Those are the legal factors. Where I tend to come in the most is, what are the practical factors? What's mom and dad's work schedule? What's the kids' school schedule? Who's in extracurriculars? Those things are all going to intermesh with one another. And those are not necessarily things that the court is going to look at as deeply as a parent and an attorney might. So if we know that, every Tuesday, little Timmy has swim class and dad's the swim coach, it probably makes sense to have little Timmy with dad on Tuesdays. That's just a practical thing that, somebody who doesn't know you and doesn't know your family, they don't know enough to include that in a schedule.
Well, I am not the swim coach, so thank God for that, right? Katie, I did want to ask you though, because I've heard other family law divorce attorneys always mention phrases like the best interest of the child, which you kind of alluded to there in that analogy. So, like, what does that standard actually look like though in the state of Pennsylvania?
To determine the best interest of the child, the judge is going to look at those now 11 custody factors, and they're going to say whether one factor favors one parent or the other. Now, if all 11 factors are equally weighted between the two parties, we're probably looking at a 50-50 schedule, unless, work schedules or living situations are totally not accommodating for that. Now, things like the preference of the child, a child's preference might not be in their best interest. The child's preference might be to eat candy for dinner and to stay up all night and to never go to school. And if one parent allows that and the other parent doesn't, even though that's the child's preference, it's not in their best interest. So the judges are trying to really weigh those factors in figuring out what's best for the kid.
I know a couple kids that would disagree with you on that front there, Katie. I did want to ask you now because we talked about misconceptions in a previous episode, and I'm sure you get these all the time. Parents assume custody follows maybe a specific pattern, default arrangements. What are some common misconceptions about how custody decisions are made that you get thrown at?
Sure. So I hear a lot of these. One is that one parent automatically gets custody, whether that's mom or whether that's dad. A dad will come in and say, "Oh, well, mom's just going to get custody, so why even bother?" That is abundantly false. There's no presumption for either parent of primary or equal shared custody. The court has to weigh all of those factors. One thing that I hear sometimes is if one party gets a new partner, that automatically custody is going to change based upon that. Or if one party gets a different job, custody is always going to change based upon that. And those things just aren't true.
Yeah, I'm sure you get that a lot with respect to people coming to you. One thing we haven't really talked about is like how does the process usually begin? Like what are the early steps that people should be expecting once custody becomes an issue?
So we'll know that custody is an issue either because parents are filing for a divorce or they're filing a custody action. They're moving separate and apart from one another. And we need to figure out where this kid's putting their head at night. And what'll happen is one parent will file a custody action with the court. That can be part of a divorce complaint, or if the parents aren't married, that can just be a separate custody action. In Montgomery County, which is my primary county of practice, the next step after filing for either a custody count in a divorce complaint or a complaint for custody is both parties will attend a parenting seminar and both parties will attend mediation. The mediator is going to try to get an idea of what their situation is and try to encourage a settlement. If we don't get a settlement at mediation, then we go to what's called conciliation. That's an attorney who is employed by the county who listens to both parents. They hear from the filing parent, maybe that's mom. They hear from the non-filing parent, maybe that's dad, maybe that's another mom, maybe it's a grandparent even. But so the conciliator will hear from everybody and they'll make a recommendation. And I will also say if the child is old enough, the conciliator might also speak with the child. And in cases where kids are 12, 13, 14, they're going to want to hear from the child and they're going to want to hear what the child thinks makes sense for them.
Katie, where's the line though, and what tends to kind of influence whether custody issues are resolved by an agreement or they do require that court involvement?
So what I always tell people is, your kids are an extension of you and they're an extension of your co-parent as well. And if you and your co-parent have really great communication skills, that is going to tend to lend towards an agreement. If you and your co-parent have some disagreements about, whether it's a legal custody issue, whether it's a communication style issue, whether it's, who's living where, if you and your co-parent are not likely to agree, people can get really entrenched in their positions and not willing to compromise. And it's really unfortunate because I get it. These are your kids. They're the most important thing to you. And sometimes it comes down to a difference of one day a week. Does dad have Sunday overnights or not? And you can get so entrenched in that single position that you're giving the decision-making power to a judge rather than making the decision yourself.
Well, staying on that front, because life changes, obviously, and you want people to communicate with these agreements. But how does the law handle if there are changes or modifications to these custody agreements?
Sure. So custody is always governed by the best interest of the child or the children. And if there's a change in circumstances that implicates their best interest, that might be something like one parent moves away out of the school district, or one parent's work schedule changes, or one parent gets remarried or starts a new relationship and has a new child. Those are all considerations that might lean towards a change in custody. Now, when you have a situation where you have, pretty good co-parenting skills and you're able to say, hey, mom, can you take the kid this weekend? I have to travel for work. Parents can just do that between themselves. Where we find ourselves going to court is where, one parent says, I want more time or I want less time, and the other parent can't agree to that.
Katie, as we kind of wrap on this episode, for that parent that's listening to this and they feel a little overwhelmed because they're at the start of the custody matters, what's the most important thing you want them to understand early on about how this process works, where they should focus their attention maybe?
Your children should be your primary focus, and it can get really hard to extract your feelings from what's best for your kids. What I sometimes tell people is, let's put everything aside. Let's put all of the emotions aside and let's look at a calendar and let's see what makes sense. Because you might want to see your kids 24/7, but factually and realistically, they're probably going to have time with the other parent. So let's look at a calendar. Let's figure out what makes sense for you, for that other parent, but most importantly, for your child.
It's always in the best interest of the child. Katie, I can't thank you enough for hopping on the pod. Thank you for the time and the insights. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.
That's it for today's episode of Family Law A to Z with DBD. If you want to learn more, you want to connect with Katie or the family team over at Shell, Bardo, and Dooley, do me a favor, visit dbdlaw.com. You're going to get the resources there that help explain this child custody process and help you understand truly what to expect. Do me one more favor before you go. Hit like, hit subscribe, leave a review, comment, share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.